The following is a video podcast from the Wessels Living History Farm.
There are a lot of barriers you have to go through in trying to change a stagnant traditional agriculture in a food deficit nation. First, the technology, the scientific package of practice. There's no magic in variety itself, no matter how good. That potential yield can't be expressed if the plant isn't fed restored fertility to the soil, or it can't express its potential if the weeds are competing with it. You know, the weeds also are having a bad time on worn out soil, but you put on the fertilizer and they'll grow faster and take over the crop, and that variety won't mean much no matter how good it is. And so it is with diseases and insects. That's the technological package. Then how the psychological thing. Everybody says the peasant farmer in these countries is resistant to change. That's not true. If he sees demonstrated on his own land that package of technology can double, triple, quadruple, like happened in India, Pakistan, and later in China, or in Argentina. But that has to be done in enough places. And that's the psychological barrier.
Right.
And then the economic barrier, the inputs that have to be available, the fertilizer, the improved seed of the varieties that you've developed, eventually weed killers. At that time there weren't any weed killers that were usable, but of course all of these things have come out now, including the selective weed killers with the biotech, the resistance gene in the soybeans and corn, so that you can apply it to the crop after it's emerged and still not destroy it, but you destroy the weeds. We didn't have those things. Right. And so the economic barrier you have to get across. And that includes also changes in policy on the availability of that right kind of fertilizer at the right time at the village level, 6 weeks before planting. And then credit. Remember that the third world, developing nation, are not farmers like the USA. They're small. They're 5, 8, 10 acres. And they have no cash to buy fertilizer. So there has to be credit to buy it before planting and pay for it at harvest. And then invariably, every place I've worked, you've got the problem of what the political people say, the ceiling price on food, basic food grains. Because they say, we've got so many poor people, we have to keep the price of grain low. Generally 30, 40, like it was in India and Pakistan, 40% lower than the world price. And they expect their farmers to compete with American, Canadian, Australian farmers, or British farmers, German, French.
Right.
At 40% less price, importing the fertilizer. And so the fourth is the political barrier. At the right time, you've got to get the political decision makers to change those things on the availability of the inputs, the credit, and the price. and to start a real campaign to get enthusiasm built into it from the political decision makers. And always in this turmoil, there are those who are trying to destroy the program for their own personal interest inside of the bureaucracy. The personal interest of some individuals, and I've seen it happen in many countries. Rockefeller and Ford Foundation sat together and they said, something's got to be done about this rice situation with the population problem in Asia. And so they had started a small program, patterned largely at the way the wheat program was organized in Mexico. I made a trip in early '60, the last trip for the Rockefeller Foundation, to cross North Africa, the Near Middle East, across Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia. Libya was still in the fold. That was before Gaddafi split, to Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Iran, Turkey, Afghanistan, which had practically no university. It was just getting started, Pakistan and India. And I wrote a report, and I said, I think maybe some of these Mexican wheats and the technology that permits them to express their personality might be useful. But the first thing that's lacking are trained people. And with the exception of India and Egypt, you don't have enough trained people to go into an emergency program to cope with the food shortage that's building. And I said, in Egypt and India, the well-trained people have come back from graduate schools in US or England or Canada or Australia, and mostly they've put on their white coats and stayed in the laboratory doing something, a continuation of their doctorate thesis, not out there in the mud and dust on the farmer's field. And I wrote 2 reports and told him that I thought some of this stuff might fit. In '63, India invited me back to look at their program in detail. They had called a field day when I knew I was coming. The Minister of Agriculture, he was there. Lots of Mexican dwarf wheats. The weeds were nearly as high as the wheat. The whole nursery was miserable. Here were these 2 guys that had been trained with me standing on the behind. They couldn't open their mouth. And we went through this, and this guy would say, you see, the Mexican wheats don't fit here. Look how good the tall Pakistan wheats are, which was true. We moved down through these 30 or 40 people, and this harangue was going on. And I was getting more and more irritated. And finally I said, look, these Mexican wheats need proper crop management practices, starting with decent seedbed preparation, which assures a good stand of plants. Secondly, fertilizer, and you say you fertilize, but all of the fertilizer, most of it, is in those weeds, not in the wheat plant. All of these pieces and the irrigation has to be put together. We were to leave the next morning on the plane to Karachi at 10 o'clock. And as we walked towards the rest house, these 2 students, ex-students of mine, they came up and they said, we have something we want to show you tomorrow before your flight. I said, okay, what time? They said at daylight. And so I had my boots and clothes on, tap on the window, and went out. It was just getting daylight. We walked to the most remote corner of the experiment station, and there were 4 beautiful plots, about the width of this room and maybe twice as long, of the best 4 new dwarf Mexican varieties that were in commercial in Mexico. And they said, there they are. You see how they fit. And I said, but why didn't you plant a nursery like that? They said they wouldn't let us. I left for Mexico. I wrote a letter. I didn't have a secretary that understood English, and I wrote a longhand, a rough draft, and there all kinds of misspelled words. And I had one thing in there. I wrote this to Dr. Cummings, the Rockefeller thing. And I said, I don't have decent secretarial staff here. You clean this up and send it to them. And I had in there too much chasing of academic butterflies going on, all kinds of comments like this, not enough down-to-earth research in agricultural science. It turns out that he corrected a little of the misspellings and sent it on, and this changed everything. We flew in a few hundred pounds of seed to India. By 1965, they decided to import 250 tons of seed of the Mexican dwarfs into those 2 countries. And Wellhausen, my boss, was on leave, and he said, you've got to stay in the office. They placed the order too late to ship it out of Guaymas port in Mexico. So we had to ship from Los Angeles to catch the last freighter that would get it in time to Pakistan, India, for planting in the middle of October. And then everything went wrong. I thought I had the border fixed so that these 35 big trucks, and we didn't have much money for this operation, were held up at the Mexican border for 2 days. And I had to pay demurrage to hold the freighter. And then they were held up for another day on the American side. Pure bureaucracy. Finally, my Mexican colleague that was supervising this, he called and he said, they're on their way to Los Angeles port, but they didn't get very far. It was the day of the Watts riot, and the National Guard was out there, stopped it. We had to, because Watts was on the route into the port from Mexico. Finally it loaded. I went home to bed. I hadn't slept for 2 nights on the telephone, and woke up, whatever it was, 18, 20 hours later, turned on the radio. And the war is on between Pakistan and India. Seed on the same freighter. It was transshipped to Singapore, which meant that it arrived 6 weeks too late for planting. There wasn't time to check the germination like we would ordinarily have done, to calibrate how much seed to plant. We planted, and I was in Pakistan digging, and I saw it was miserable. And so I had decided to double seeding rate, did a lot of praying, and put on more fertilizer and handled the water. And by the time, shortly before Christmas, I left, I had visited both Pakistan and India. And I could see this beautiful harvest and the enthusiasm of the farmer everywhere. Frosty Hill, the vice president of Ford Foundation, he used to say, they may be illiterate, but they can figure. They can figure whether it's going to help their families or not. and they aren't afraid to change if they see that the margins of change are not 10%, which our farmers would jump at. But if you're at the starvation age, that 10% difference might be the difference of rain this year or temperature, and they can't risk that. But if it's double, 50%, double, triple, they're ready if the government gives them the tools with which to work. And that's the story of what happened. Traveling with Swaminathan, the top young scientist, we got a call the last day when we were in Ludhiana University in the Punjab to stop at the Escort tractor factory for lunch. We drove into the factory and there was probably 300 small tractors unsold. Mr. Nanda, the president, said, maybe Dr. Borlaug would like to say a few words. He's been traveling, seen all the wheat region last month. And here's all the press. And I figured this is the time. And so I said, yes, I would. And I told him about the enthusiasm, the wonderful result. Everywhere you stop, in a few minutes, there's 200 people around pulling on your sleeve and pointing down here to come and see their plot. And I said, Mr. Nanda, the president of the company, if the Indian government makes 3 decisions now, all of those tractors out there will disappear in a week, and you won't be able to catch up with orders for years to come. Those points are, the seed is here. Subramaniam brought it in. It's in the ground. The harvest of the seed that's necessary will do the job. What we need now is fertilizer, fertilizer, fertilizer. Imported in the short term, factories built in the long term. Credit, credit, credit for these small farmers to buy the fertilizer at time of planting and pay for it at harvest. And a fair price at harvest, announced before planting, that it will reflect the international market. You've got to get the ceiling off that price, which is 40% less than the world price. This is what you expect your farmers, with all of their handicaps, to compete with Canadian, U.S., and Australian farmers. And I sat down, I said, I wish I were a member of the Lok Sabha, and I would stand up every 15 minutes and scream, fertilizer, 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 credit, 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 fair price, fair price, fair price. Swaminathan and I were supposed to go at 6 o'clock the next afternoon. And just as I was leaving the minister's office the day of the discussion, he said, you tell Ashok Mehta, Deputy Prime Minister, just as bluntly as you tell me things of importance in policy when we're alone in my office. He needs to hear them now on those 3 points. And so when we were waiting to go in, I told Swaminathan, I'm going to follow Minister Subramaniam's suggestion. I'm going to be blunt. You better not get into this issue. I may get thrown out of the country. But if I do, you and Anderson can carry on. This thing, I think there's enough inertia, enough momentum that nobody can stop it if we get the fertilizer credit and fair price. So we went in, and after the courtesies of a minute or two, then I said, this disaster is of your party. Last month, you lost virtually all yours. You've got that much margin left in the park. Unless this changes and changes soon on fertilizer credit and pricing, you won't sit in that chair a year from now. They'll throw you out. Those grassroots are a fire. I don't know if there's 400,000 of those little farmers, or whether there's 1 million. They know what's possible now. It's up to you, of course. He exploded, and we both talked till we ran out of breath. And I left. 10 days later, I got the clippings out of the next morning paper from the main Indian papers, from both Ford and another one from Rockefeller. Said, as of last night at midnight, India's policy on fertilizer was changed at least till the end of the year. There had been negotiations for establishing new fertilizer plants, but anything that hadn't been signed by the 31st of March, that midnight, I didn't know this, would be canceled. But it said, this has been extended till the end of the year. They've never been changed. Everything changed. How much that had to do with it will never be known. But here at Texas A&M, I suppose it was 1984, when there was a conference international conference on water irrigation. Subramaniam, the minister who had been defeated, was a speaker, and he said from the podium, he said, the best hour of Borlaug's life, the most productive, was that hour talking to Minister Subramaniam. This tremendous change in food production that took place in India and Pakistan, I'll use the case of wheat, but it happened on rice and several crops. But the first one was on wheat. The average production from 1960 to 65 was 11 million metric tons.
Worldwide?
For India.
In India, okay.
In the year 2000, it was 75 million tons, nearly fivefold. Pakistan went from 3.5 million to 20 million. Turkey doubled 2.5 times the production. It started taking off in a lot of countries. Egypt was good before, but it became much better after these new young trained people came into power. And the so-called Green Revolution was this tremendous change. The new rices came in. If you make a breakthrough on one crop, the research people have to get to work on the other ones too. That little farmer sees if that fertilizer works on wheat, it's going to work on rice too, his second crop, or on corn. China came into the picture indirectly by way of Pakistan. When I was, I guess in 1965, and had just arrived in Pakistan, I was going down the hall, and the Secretary of Agriculture, not the minister, he was trained in forestry originally like I was, so we had kind of soul brothers, and he says, I'm glad you arrived before I left. I'm leaving this afternoon for China. He said, you see that box I got under my arm? Yeah, what's in it? He said, lots of little samples of Mexican wheat.
For more, go to www.livinghistoryfarm.org.